Kia ora koutou, welcome to the NDF online session on digital preservation. Ko teina hursa toku ingoa, ko kai whakahaere Matua of the National Digital Forum, NDF. My name is Teina Hursa. I'm the Executive Director of the National Digital Forum. Welcome today, no mau haere mai. We have a few housekeeping things we're going to cover off very quickly. Because it's lunchtime, please keep your camera off if you, well, feel free to. Keep your camera off, and also please keep yourself muted. We will be taking questions. Because there's quite a number of us here today, could you please pop your questions in the chat? And when it comes to the end of the session, we will run through these questions and Val and Marty will answer them. Like I said, please keep yourself muted and let's get started. So today we are joined by Val Love and Martin Gengenbach, hopefully I pronounced that correctly, from National Library. So Val is an NDF board member and she's Kaipupuri, Pūranga, Matihiko, Matua, Senior Digital Archivist at the Alexander Turnbull Library, Te Puna Mā Tauranga o Aotearoa National Library of New Zealand. Val's responsible for the transfer, ingest and management of unpublished born digital heritage collections. She's a regular presenter and trainer on the topic and is passionate about helping individuals and community groups to better maintain and preserve their own digital files. I'm going to hand over to Val now and she will take it from here. Kia ora.
Kia ora koutou. Ho Valerie Love toku ingoa. No America aho, e mahiana aho ki te puna mataranga o Aotearoa. And I'm now regretting the decision to not kick my cat out of the room, who has just decided to come sit on all of my computer setup over here. So hopefully she won't be too disruptive. But hello, everyone. My name is Valerie Love. I'm the Senior Digital Archivist at the Turnbull Library. I'm also currently acting Digital Collections Team Leader. And I'm here with my colleague, Marty Gengenbach, who is the Digital Preservation and Policy and Outreach Specialist for the Digital Preservation and Data Capability Team here at the National Library of New Zealand. So I'm just going to go ahead and start sharing the slides. Is that looking good? Okay, great. Sorry, I will push my cat out of the way very briefly. Apologies for that. And I realize you can't even see her because of my background, but she is clearly very interested in digital preservation as well. Okay, so Digital Preservation 101. Today we're going to give a brief overview of digital preservation, what we mean by digital preservation, some digital file basics, and talk about some of the issues that you might encounter when you're working with born digital files. And then after that, I'm going to hand over to Marty, and he's going to talk about different types of digital files and how to identify them, and give some digital preservation strategies to ensure that you can access digital content long-term. And then there'll be some time for questions at the end. So what do we mean by digital preservation? Digital preservation is part of the digital curation life cycle, and essentially digital preservation is like collection care or conservation treatments that you would do for physical collection materials, but just with your digital content. So in the same way that we need to take steps to ensure that physical materials will last into the future, we need to do the same with digital content. So digital preservation is active management of digital files. And so taking those actions to care for them now to ensure that they will continue to be accessible into the future. We have taken some information from our colleagues at Te Rua Mahara o Te Kawanatanga, who have a digital preservation statement on their website, which I encourage you to take a look at. But basically, the digital preservation methods that you'll take depend upon what the content is and the purpose of that content and the significant properties of it to make sure that it can be rendered over time, and also that the content continues to be authentic over time. And the other thing is that digital preservation needs to overcome the challenges of media failure and technological change. And this is really a big one. We are constantly dealing with changing technology, changing types of digital media. The ways in which digital files are being created today and used is very different than how they were created 10, 20, 30 years ago. And that's going to continue to change over time. So we need to be continually looking at the technology and looking at the changes in technology and making sure that our files are going to continue to be accessible. So what is not digital preservation? So digitization is not actually digital preservation in and of itself. Digitization, the making of things digital, can aid preservation, particularly if it is for a fragile analog or physical item, and also particularly for AV media. Digitization is definitely preservation there, but those digital files need preservation. So just because something has been digitized doesn't mean that the work is done. And the other thing that's not digital preservation is storage. So simply putting a hard drive or a USB in a nice acid-free box and putting it in the collection stores is a good step in terms of protecting that physical content, but it's not actually going to ensure that the digital files on that USB or hard drive continue to be accessible over time. And backups are great, but again, they're not enough on their own. They're all just sort of steps in the process of digital preservation. So digital preservation is a continuous and perpetual process, which basically includes the activities that you're doing on and with your digital files. And it's not just storing those files away and assuming that we can render them and understand their content in the future. So getting into some digital basics, what do we actually mean by digital? So digital can be lots of different things to different people. In this case, when we actually look at the basics of a digital file, we're looking at strings of data. We're looking at the individual bits, the ones and the zeros, and the bytes that are written to a hard disk to convey information. And we're using file systems to control how that digital data is stored and retrieved. There are operating systems that locate and index the files within the file systems. And this is all really important contextual information because without these technical setups, a digital file is essentially useless. So it needs to have specific hardware, it needs to have specific software, and it needs to have something that can interpret those software instructions to say what the file is. So there's also important metadata such as the file names and the locations of digital files, and that's often not part of the digital file itself. That information is also often stored externally. So there's lots of pieces that have to be in exactly the right way in order to make a digital file function. So this is where we get into a lot of technical challenges, because if something isn't in that exact the exact situation that it needs to be for a digital file to render or to be viewable, then we can have trouble accessing it. So we run into a lot of technical challenges, and sometimes they're just really basic things like the media carriers that the digital files are on might degrade over time. So you might have a hard disk that fails, you might have a floppy disk that gets damaged. And so these and USBs and hard drives and things like that only have a finite lifespan. They're not going to last forever. They're often going to last about 10, 15 years, maybe 20 years if you're lucky, before the actual physical parts of them begin to degrade. The other issue that we see a lot is that files that were created and stored in one system, such as a Macintosh environment, may not actually be compatible in other operating systems. So something we encounter a lot at the library is that a creator will generate content on a Macintosh computer, and then when we try to read that on our corporate PC, Windows machines, we're not necessarily able to render that content. And then the other thing is that the file and operating systems become obsolete. And that can cause accessibility and security issues. And the software that is needed to render files can also become obsolete or unavailable, or sometimes just not backwards compatible, where the newest version of the software won't actually read older versions of files that were created with that same software, but just the earlier iteration of it. And we also come across a lot of encoding issues where if a text-based file hasn't been encoded properly, the text might not render properly. And you can see an example of that on the slide where it was a word processing document from an early piece of software, but now it's not actually able to be read. And the file at the bottom, which is the image of the school kids, is actually an example where the file degraded over time. So the blank space at the bottom is actually missing pixels. So we do sometimes encounter things like that. And honestly, in terms of the things that we think about a lot in digital preservation, obsolescence is probably the #1 issue. Again, materials that are no longer able to be read on modern equipment because they were created on something that's now completely obsolete, or there's not the drive needed to read a floppy disk on a modern computer. So sometimes these things can be difficult to access. And also optical discs. These were a really popular way of saving content for quite a long time, and people thought that CDs and DVDs would last quite a while, but they actually have a very short lifespan. So we do see the actual discs themselves begin to degrade, and then that impacts the content that's on them. The other thing to be aware of in terms of digital preservation is the loss of context and knowledge about your digital files. So we can't just look at a digital file the same way that we can, look at a photograph or a physical object where we can read it without having to dive deeper. So with a digital file, there's a lot of contextual information about the file itself that's important to capture to ensure that the digital file will have long-term value and be accessible. So digital files can often get sort of separated from the context in which they were created. Who created them? What was the purpose? What does the file relate to? How do I open it? What software does it require? How do I access the files that are on an obsolete media carrier? These are all questions and issues that we encounter on a regular basis. So in terms of practical application of digital preservation, the main considerations are to get to know your files. And this is always what I really recommend as your starting point. So determining what digital content you already have and finding out where it's actually located, because oftentimes there's a lot more digital files and digital content and digital collection materials than we actually realize. A lot of times there will be a disk that gets tucked in a drawer someplace. Digital can be out of sight, out of mind, because it's not taking up physical space on a box on your desk. It's on a computer, it's out of sight. So these are some of the dangers of digital preservation dangers that encounter when digital files are just sort of left on their own and not actively managed. So we really encourage you to get to know your files, know what hardware and software is required to render them, know what the digital and analog components are, if there are different parts required, and if there's any technical dependencies. And then also, if you have things that are if you have collection materials that are on obsolete carriers, like those old floppy disks, or like the CD or another optical disc, we really encourage you to begin to extract that content so that way it can be preserved on a more stable medium, so a contemporary hard drive or a server, something like that. In terms of your content, knowing different types and formats, and does your content actually render? We find this a lot with older database files where they were created using an older bespoke software, and now those database files just won't open properly and you can't actually view the content very easily. And then finally, the metadata for files. So available descriptions, what the access and use of digital files will be, and also file fixity, which we're going to talk a little bit later about in the presentation. So this was the part where I was meant to hand over to Marty, but I think Marty's Zoom has just dropped out. So I'm going to continue talking until he's able to rejoin us in the meeting. So as I've said, in terms of getting started with your digital files and understanding what you have is really that first step. So what types of digital collection materials do you have? What types of files? What types of digital content do you have, and what types of media carriers? So there's lots of different. Oh, it does look like Marty's back. Marty, I was just sort of starting to talk about digital files, but I'm happy to hand over if you're ready to go.
Perfect.
Or if you need a minute, I can keep talking.
Happy to, and apologies. No, I'm all good. Apologies for the delay. My Zoom chose the most inopportune time to disconnect. So as Val mentioned in the previous slide around practical application of digital preservation, we really highly recommend getting to know your files, and what that really means is understanding what types of formats you have. So the format is a way that your computer interacts with the that's a great question, Andrew, and we'll come to it. The format is the way that your computer interacts with the actual bit stream, right? The ones and zeros, the way that your computer interprets that into something that you are able to see on the screen. You can see a bunch of examples of some of the more common. To know your formats and getting to understand more about them is actually through some of the tools that I'm about to speak about directly. So you can switch the slide, Val. Oh. Am I on the slide? Thank you. So the primary way digital preservation that we identify file formats is through the use of technical registries, which are basically databases that are maintained by third parties that provide information about different types of file characteristics. So the one that you see on the screen is the technical registry Pronom that is maintained by the National Archives in the UK. So there are different tools that access this technical registry and then collect information based on the file types that you have in order to provide you reports about the different sorts of versions and different types of content that you have in your collections. So the NDHA at the National Library holds over 260 different file formats in our collections. So each of those formats requires some kind of software to be able to render and access them properly. Without that software, it's just the bits, which are essentially useless, despite how carefully we may have been backing up and preserving that content. So understanding what kinds of file formats we have in our collections allows us to plan for their long-term preservation and access needs. There's some examples that you can see on the right side of your screen. These are all tools that work in relatively the same way, where they scan your files looking for particular pieces of information, which they check against the database to understand what types of formats you have. I will say that for files of greater complexity, there are different tools that are available out there that can provide more detailed information about their file content. So something like Media Info is a tool down at the bottom there that is specific for understanding what your digital audio-visual materials may include. So if you switch to the next screen, Val, thank you. Media Info provides a lot more granular information about what sorts of video formats, color schemes, things like that, things that are important for understanding how to interpret and render AV images, 3D materials. But the same underlying considerations apply as dealing with any other type of digital content when you're working with digital audio and video, right? You want to understand what that file is so that you're able to make decisions about its long-term preservation. We can change the slide next. Another really important quality in understanding what your files are and what files you have is the ability to ensure that they have not been changed over time. This is important for understanding or for maintaining the authenticity of the content. That value, the property of being unchanged, we refer to as fixity. Checksums are one way that we ensure fixity and integrity of files over time. So a checksum is essentially a fingerprint for a digital file or for a set of files. By generating and confirming checksums, we can see if a digital file has changed over time. Cryptographic hash is a kind of checksum that generates a unique string of numbers. So this is most commonly the way that you will encounter checksums in digital preservation work is through common cryptographic hashes such as MD5, SHA-1, and SHA-256. And you can see an example of it there on the screen. We can change slides. So some common uses for fixity and checksums. If the checksums match, we can be confident that our digital content is consistent with what we originally received and what we are providing out. If the checksums don't match, we then know there's been a change to the files, though we don't necessarily know what. So a checksum only tells you whether something has changed. It does not tell you how something has changed, if it has indeed. But it's incredibly important to be able to document that over time for transparency and accountability purposes, to say, particularly with things like public records, to say that we have maintained the files in the state that we received them. So this can be useful for things like copying files from one location to another. You can check and see that the checksum remains the same on either end. For preservation, continuous validation and delivery, this is something that is often done in digital preservation systems automatically, where preservation systems consistently run checksums over file content just to make sure that nothing has changed. It can also be useful for managing duplicates. Checksums or files that are the same to the bit level will have the same checksum, so you can use that to understand where duplicates may exist, as well as we had mentioned, ensuring authenticity. We can change slides. So there are a number of different digital preservation strategies that can be considered for your digital content. Once you have gotten to know kind of what you have and have done some documentation around what you've got. The first two are maybe have questionable longevity, I'll say. Maintaining the original technical environment. This is to an earlier question about, classic computer enthusiasts or kind of legacy technologies. Trying to keep early machines running is very challenging. It can also be a risk to modern IT security environments. So it's not particularly a viable option, but it is something that has a very avid following and active following in different parts of the world. Maintaining the original technical environment, the original hardware and software to run a file in its original context is probably not a long-term strategy, just due to the rising costs and risks of trying to maintain that environment. Eventually, you're going to run out of spare parts. You can also replace the original software with something backwards compatible. So there are software tools out there that can be used to access, I would say, legacy formats through backwards compatibility. However, this can be challenging because it doesn't always work, and it doesn't always work in the way that the original did. So you may be subjecting your files to inadvertent changes or inadvertent loss of information just through the software that you're using to access it. A third strategy is to emulate. So this is creating a virtual version of a suitable environment, replicating the old operating system and software on a modern machine in a virtual environment to preserve the look and feel of the original, but in a modern, up-to-date, secure environment. The downside of emulation is that it takes a lot of, I'd say, technical knowledge about the environment itself to be developed, and it can be very resource heavy. Though there are a lot of initiatives currently underway to try to make emulation more accessible to a wider variety of users. And finally, migrating digital content into a new format that can be accessed. So we do this frequently at the National Library and Archives, where we identify formats or identify files for preservation and migrate those forward into new formats that can be accessed in contemporary systems while maintaining the preservation of the original file contents for the purpose of authenticity and transparency. This can be, migrating to new technology environments. You can think about this as digitization as a form of migration, where you are capturing a physical record in a digital form. So this is something that is very common across many different technology environments. Let's go forward. So the basis of the preservation strategies that we've been talking about, and the basis of all digital preservation, is really around this bitstream preservation, retaining the integrity of information and records through your standard backup and security. But also, this bitstream preservation does not necessarily address what I was talking about a moment ago with migration. Is it does not address the accessibility of the content over time, right? Retaining the ones and zeros is really the foundation for future preservation activities, so that you have a record of what was originally received and can have something to work from. So people think this is digital preservation in many contexts, that it's not. It is the necessary foundation for what is called active preservation, which is actually the preservation of intellectual content rather than just bit streams, right? So this is thinking about the logical or the way, the look and feel potentially, or the informational content of the preservation object. So a digital preservation program based around logical preservation includes things like assessing the risks relevant for that information and file formats over time, generating the technical and administrative preservation metadata, all of the kind of pieces of information that provide the full context of how a file interacted in its origination system of origination. And then also allowing to manage and enhance metadata about files to provide additional context to facilitate further usability. And then being able to work from that information to generate new derivatives over time, to deploy preservation actions like migrations to provide meaningful access to that content in the future. So if you want to preserve it, you need to know and understand what it is. All of this suggests that digital preservation is not just a one person or can be, but there are many moving parts to a digital preservation environment and a digital preservation program. This includes a system or systems to be working in to store information about digital content, as well as the digital content itself. There is the digital content itself and the environment in which it's stored, the policies that dictate how you manage that content, and the people to actually do it. So it's a very complex operation. It can be one person doing the whole thing. And that's something that we're really eager to talk more about for people, is like where to get started and some of the low resource, low effort tips to getting started with some of this. And we do have a number of different digital preservation resources available, lots of stuff online. Paid particular attention to the NDF Hub, Intro to Digital Preservation Resources, and some coming into NDF digital preservation videos, as well as the iPres International Conference on Digital Preservation, which will be hosted here in Wellington in November of 2025, so mark it on your calendars. There's also a number of things listed here. I believe we'll be making some links available for that as well. The local group Australasia Preserves is very active as well in the Digital Preservation Coalition's Australasia chapter that provides a lot of resources for getting started in digital preservation. And with that, I think we can go to questions.
Thanks, Marty. Thanks, Val. That's quite a lot. It's certainly not a simple undertaking, and I know it's something that pretty much every organisation in New Zealand probably has a few floppy disks and a few computer software and yeah, a scary box somewhere that they need to open up and deal with. So we've got a question here from Kimmich from the University of Otago. Has there been any investigation into emulation as a service here in Aotearoa as they have in Australia? Over to you guys. I have no idea myself, so.
Yeah, I was trying to unmute there. Sorry. I think the question is referring to the Oz Easy project that Cindy Moya is doing out of, oh gosh, I'm forgetting the name of the institution now, but we are involved in that as sort of a partner here at the library. So we are keeping tabs on that research and very interested in continuing to work with Cindy and her team on that project. But there's no independent kind of similar research project that's going on because we're kind of working with Cindy in that way. Val, is that?
Yeah, that's exactly right.
Yeah. Okay.
Awesome, thank you. We also have Freya from Motet, Freya Elma. She's saying, do you have any recommendations? She's saying, first of all, thank you. That was extremely helpful. Do you have any recommendation for checksum software?
Yeah, so there's definitely a number of pieces of software that will generate checksums. So the main one that we use is the Droid software that was developed by the National Archives in the UK, so that can generate checksums. There's also file list creation tools that can generate checksums, and then the different tools that will move files from one location to another. If they're good tools, they'll also generate checksums, so that way you've got that certainty that the file hasn't changed during that moving process. So things like free commander, double commander, those will generate checksums as part of the moving process or the transfer process of those files.
Thanks. Andrew Hales has said they use TerraCopy. And just a note that everyone will be sent a recording, the link to the recording of this this webinar once we have done. And what we'll do is we'll put any of the links that are mentioned here in their email so that you have that information as well. Evan G has said, we have seen that people have seen microfiche, then floppy disks, then CDs as digital storage solutions for the long term, but have been proven wrong. Do you foresee a future problem brewing with current physical/digital formats? And if so, how can these be mitigated?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and it's definitely something that we're seeing a lot of. Yeah, none of these
crystal ball out.
I mean, unfortunately, even none of the media storage for digital files are particularly durable long term. So I mean, I think when they were talking about gold CDs that would last 100 years, and that's not even close. So in fact, some of the gold CDs had a shorter a shorter shelf life than just regular CDs because of the different materials that were used, and the top layer is a bit more fragile. So there's no, I mean, Marty, correct me if I'm wrong, but to my knowledge, there's no like long-term strategy or long-term tool for or thing for digital preservation. It really is just continually, actively knowing what you have, knowing what file formats are at risk, and migrating those to something that's more stable today, and then knowing that you're going to have to continually do that process, because even things like servers, you know, they'll need to be migrated, you know, so it's definitely an ongoing process.
Yeah, I think in addition to that, I would add that this is why there's a benefit to keeping things in multiple different storage formats. So this could mean anything from, you know, if you have something on a USB, also copying that onto a CD, or copying that onto another sort of stable storage environment. Nobody uses CDs anymore, or not many people, I suppose. But even, you know, for my like personal materials, I have them backed up to a Google Drive, and I also have them backed up to Apple Photos. So even two separate cloud environments can serve as two different storage environments for that purpose, right? So it's about having redundancy involved so that you're not relying on a single point of failure for any sort of preservation environment.
Thanks, guys. Next question from Jethro Wright is, are people in our sector exploring the Australian preserves courseware? Australasian, excuse me. Australasian preserves.
Yeah, that's a good question. I was involved in the development of the courseware, and I know that it was used initially when it was first created a few years back. I don't know if anybody's actually currently exploring it or using it as training. I'd love to know if anybody does actually know the answer to that.
Oh, if you are, can you just pop a note in the chat, and then we can get some discussion happening there. Andrew Martin has said, can you recommend strategies for evaluating digital preservation software systems? Is there any way you can point us to with that?
Yeah, I think so. I think there's a really great opportunity to tailor a particular digital preservation software system to your own business needs, particularly for an institution. You know, thinking about what your main drivers are, what it is you're trying to do with that system before you start looking out to go and buy one. And once you have those kind of needs in place, those requirements, you can kind of set out your own rubric for how you would evaluate those. That said, the DPC does have some really good resources on procurement and selection of digital preservation systems. There's also, if you have the opportunity to attend or view sessions from previous iPres, they generally have some kind of a bake-off or comparison where they have different providers demonstrating systems. You can also look online to see some really easy kind of demos of the different tools that are out there. And then I also would highly encourage just reaching out to different people who use, if there's an organization that you're connected to in some way that knows that is using a particular system, just ask how they like it, what they're doing with it, what they wish they were doing differently. The challenge with these systems is that they are and can be they can be very complex and can have, you know, different implementations so that the same system is being used very differently in different environments. So just asking questions and talking to people is always a good option too.
Thanks, Marty. Okay, the next question is from Haley, and that is, when items get older and knowledge is lost as to how to use it, do you have to create accompanying documents to describe how to interact?
Yes, I so highly recommend that. This is something that we do as well when we're working with donors that have created digital content using really bespoke software or really niche software tools, particularly like music composition software. These are programs that I, don't use myself in my regular life, so I'm not familiar with how to use them. So when we have people creating digital content using these really niche pieces of software, we need to get as much information from them as possible, so that we understand how the files interact, how they were meant to behave, and how people can access them going forward. So documentation is your best friend in terms of digital preservation and digital archiving. It's really, really important, and it's always, it can take a while to come up with the documentation and make sure that everything is documented, but it's super important.
Thank you. And Nicola Sedergicato, is a name familiar to us, said, I once spent 6 months trying to track down a zip drive reader. Are there any resources for tracking down hardware to read some of these older formats?
Yeah, solidarity there. I've been in the same position with, it took us, I think about 2 years to find a jazz drive reader. So it can be really challenging to find some of this older tech. There are things that pop up on Trade Me from time to time. We found things on eBay. There's some vintage computing Facebook group that sometimes, people offer things, and we're really, really lucky at the library that we have some old tech aficionados on staff. So the first thing that I do is chat with colleagues to see, hey, does anybody actually have this type of drive that I need for this collection item? And it is sort of a mixed bag whether or not you'll be able to access the content or not. We've spent a lot of time trying to read files and then discovering that actually the disk was blank, things like that. So it is, it's always a bit of a mystery. But yeah, it's just sort of, trying your best and looking for things and talking to people. And yeah, it is a challenge for sure.
Thanks, Val. We had some questions submitted when people registered, so I'm just going to run through a couple of these while we've still got time. So one of them was around digital rot, which is sounds pretty fascinating. Like I can see a sci-fi film around that. But what can be done once it's found, and how do you actively look for it?
Yeah, I mean, it's honestly not something that we encounter a lot. There was the JPEG image that had the missing pixels. When we investigated that, we actually discovered that the image was like that when it was transferred to us. So it was most likely an issue at the time of the creation of the file rather than the file degrading over time. But definitely things do degrade. So I think having backups is really important. So that way, if one file stops rendering, hopefully you have another version of it in a different place that still works. Yeah.
We have another question around metadata.
Yeah, I think incorporating.
Oh, sorry.
Or go ahead. Sorry.
No, you carry on.
No, just incorporating, some sort of redundancy into whatever your preservation strategy is, so that you're trying to prevent resting on a single version or a single copy of any file is one of the best ways that you can prevent that.
Thank you.
That's it.
We have a question around metadata standards. So this person was looking at what sort of metadata standards might New Zealand have in terms specifically around large media files, and where they might be able to find information about that.
Is Josh still on the call? Our colleague, Josh Ng from Archives New Zealand, who has a lot of experience with AV media. I forgot to actually look up the answer to this in advance, but we can provide some information in the follow-up email. Or Josh, if you want to jump in and talk about metadata standards.
Sorry, I missed the question. What was the question? Sorry.
The question came through in registration, and that this person was interested in what sort of metadata standards Aotearoa might have, particularly for large media files.
I don't think we have our own, but in terms of metadata standards, and large media doesn't only include AV. Obviously, there are also other large media. But if we are talking about AV, the metadata standards that we go with are usually based on the associations. So the IASA technical committee documentations would be a good place to start. I think we need more. I will need more context as to what the person who's asking the question is trying to get to. But if it's about digitization, we'll look at the US FATG metadata standards as well. There's a few going around, but I don't think there is a specific New Zealand one. That's the thing.
Okay, thank you for that. Right, we're at 1 o'clock, so I'm sure people are going to start to drop off to their other meetings, but does anyone else have any more questions before we wrap up? Pop them in the chat. There's a couple of useful links you'll see there. So Claire has put links to some metadata there, some standards. We've also got links to the easy, I'm sure I'm pronouncing that wrong, emulator. And as I said before, we will be providing a video of this webinar, and we'll be including any links that we mentioned here today. And of course, yeah, feel free to keep the conversation going. You know how to find us. And thank you again for your time, and thank you for joining us today. Thank you very much to Val. Thank you very much to Marty. Thank you to Holly, who's hiding behind the NDF logo up there. Hope you enjoy, and all of you enjoy the rest of your day, and we will see you next time, well, Holly, what are we talking about next time? I can't remember. It's on the NDF website, ndf.org.nz. Go and check it out. And I think we're talking about AI. That's right. So we look forward to seeing you all again then. Thank you very much.